Hey, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for the first REACH webinar of the series. There's going to be 8 different sessions we're going to host over the next about, I guess now it's about 2.5 months. It's going to be happening on Wednesdays. Some of them are at 1 p.m., some of them are at 7 p.m., depending upon availability and topic of when we thought people might be interested in tuning in. And we're really excited that we're going to get this kicked off. We're doing this based on some funding that we were able to receive from the Canadian Paralympic Committee. And so we're really looking to answer some of the common or not so common questions that people have about paraswimming. So this webinar series is going to cover everything from classification to what does it look like in a practice to work with an athlete with an impairment, as well as we're going to talk to some officials are going to talk about what meets look like and from their perspective. We're also going to talk about what does the athlete pathway look like, what does the coach's pathway look like. So I'm really excited about this series. I think we're going to be able to answer lots of questions that people may have. And one thing I'm going to encourage people, if they are going to tune into these different sessions, is if you have any questions that pop up maybe between the sessions that you think might be important to be asked, and if you're questioning it, probably other people are too, you can email that to me, and we will be able to answer those questions at the following session. So very excited that we're getting this going, and we're very happy today that we have Laura McPhie, who just finished giving a great presentation on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion 101, very high level. And now with this session, we're going to take that and we're going to apply it to the para swimming context. So Laura, thank you so much for agreeing to do another session today. We're very excited to have you here. And with that, I'm going to let Laura introduce herself and get the session going.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I will note that this builds off of the last session. It also has a couple repeats, just as a reminder. So if you did not come to the last session, that's okay. I'll try to touch on some of the pieces. And I will be then building off of it. This will also be a very interactive session. So what I'm hoping to get from you folks is for you folks to have some pens and paper around to keep notes for yourself, but also for you to put things in the chat. I'm going to be pausing quite often to ask for community feedback and thoughts as well. So just be prepared. And I'm going to make sure the chat is open for me. To introduce myself, I know some of you were in the last session and got to hear my blurb about myself, but I'll introduce myself again. So I'm a member of Pikwakanagan First Nation and of settler descent. I am a bunch of various diversities, I would say, kind of come together in me. Identify as queer. I am neurodivergent, which neurodivergent means that your brain just works differently than the average brain. So I have ADHD, and I'm also a trauma survivor. So I kind of carry that all in how I facilitate in the space that I'm in, and the approach that I'm going to take with this as well. I do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and work right now with a lot of different groups. And that is also something I'll be carrying around with kind of like how I present as well. Before I start, it's always really important to acknowledge the land that we are on as a partner and as a active member of the space we're in. And so I am lucky to be on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. And they're collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. So Miigwech Nawe, thank you for this space and for being stewards of the land that I am on. As with the last session, I want to start, again, I always start with the note of humility, which is one of our wise teachings. And Wolf represents humility in that this sort of learning is awkward. It is a close friend of mine phrases it as it's sitting in the mud together. We're sitting in the mud together. It's awkward. It doesn't feel great. Oftentimes it's catching yourself and understanding that in the past you might have done something incorrectly or wrong. You might have hurt someone in the past, and acknowledging that, and not as a way of bringing guilt and not as a way of like beating yourself up over it, but as an acknowledgement that we can all do better when we know better. So just moving forward. So humility of self, being humble to yourself and giving yourself some space to grow, and that we're not always who we used to be. And also just humility to the topic of knowing that we don't know everything. It's just the way it is. I'm learning every day. Today, you'll see this symbol quite often, this picture. And pretty much what that means is I'm going to be asking you folks to be thinking, to be writing things down, to be reflecting, and potentially to share as a group. Some of the things I'll say is personal reflection, and some of the things I'll say is group reflection. Group reflection, I'm asking you folks to type things in the chat so we can learn together and build together, because honestly, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a lot of different approaches. And the best way to think things through is talking to other people. I want to do just some acknowledgements at the beginning to the fact that this is not easy. So oftentimes what we're looking for is a straight path. If I do this, this will happen. If I do this, people will be happy, and so on. And it's just a simple solution. And it also at the same time is often like looking at a mountain that you just don't know how to get up. So there's this paralyzation that happens when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, where people are so afraid of doing something wrong that they don't do anything at all. Or they're so afraid that, not afraid, the mountain is so high they don't even know where to start. And so again, they don't do anything at all. And what I would say is that the most important thing is that you do something. And it can be the smallest steps, and we'll be talking about what that looks like today. The tiniest steps are okay. You don't need to, you're not solving racism, right? What you're doing is hopefully creating new structures or different steps to solve little things. And so when it comes to para-swimming, what are the little steps you could do to create a more inclusive space for para-athletes? And the reality of any time you go towards diversity and inclusion work, it looks something along this line and somewhere along the way. People, you'll be confused, you'll ask for directions, you won't know where to go, you'll get some success, you get some fights, people will be upset at you. Those are all just part of the process of opening up our eyes to the fact that there's different people out there who need different things, and they'll may be upset along the way, and people might get upset at you, particularly groups that feel like you're providing something extra to a group that's not them. And that's something that's very normal in these processes. And just understanding that people are going to be upset with you. It happens all the time. I get people mad at me all the time for this sort of thing. And I'm going to do a quick review of the last session, not a big deep dive the way we did, but just over a couple of the key concepts, DEI, and why they're important. And then we're going to think specifically around how we can think about that when it comes to para-athletes. So diversity, equity, and inclusion work recognizes that it challenges privileges that we have generally benefited from. So in that, the analogy that's often given to me is that there's a pie, And one group of people are used to getting the whole pie for themselves. And another group of people have come along and they're like, hey, can we have a bit of the pie, like a slice? We don't want the whole thing. We just want a slice of the pie. But this group is used to getting the whole pie for themselves. So it feels like they're losing something, feels like a loss. It isn't necessarily, it's a sharing. So we're sharing space. We're opening it up to be more inclusive of space. And DI work is founded on the idea that our world is unfair. And part of our job is to flip that fairness and use our privilege to help groups that have been historically and systemically discriminated against. And so that's using what we have as power in order to help another group. And that equality is just not possible yet. I would love to live in an equal world. It's like 200, 300 years down the road. We're just not there yet. And also, it can be very harmful, right? So knowing that equality isn't the answer, equality is something that is a nice ideal. But if you approach situations with simply an equality brain set, you will hurt someone along the way or exclude someone along the way. So just for the basic terms, diversity is when there is a variety of types of humans and types of experiences in a room. And so spaces have been traditionally pretty exclusive. And so one group of people, one type of people controls the space. They control hiring, they control firing. They are the role models, they're who people look to. Token of burden, inclusion, and diversity is when there's one person of a type representing, or one person of minority of any type in the space. And that can just create a lot of burden on that person to be representative of a community that is pretty, of a community that is diverse unto itself. And then diverse is when you have a mixture of folks in a space, different shapes, different sizes, different thought processes, different worldviews. And in swimming, we're not going to end up with like every type of person in the room. It's just not going to happen. There's millions of different combinations of experiences and worldviews, but you're looking for difference, just some difference. And you're looking for it in multiple ways. So there is both visual diversity. So that's when you can look at a person and you're like, you're different than me. So skin color is an important one, visual diversity. And then there's non-visual diversity. So something like income is not visual, but drastically changes your view and how you engage with the world. So that's diversity. Inclusion is when diverse folks are seen for their differences and valued, accommodated, and respected for them. So what's important here is that difference doesn't mean bad. Difference means value. They come with a different point of view. They can check my blind spots. They understand a different perspective. They're accommodated for it. So maybe a religious holiday is on Friday and they're not able to go to most practices on Friday. Or they're fasting through the day, and so they need to not work as hard at practice. So that could be something where there's accommodation. And respected, that we respect difference, that we respect that it's important and that it adds value. My team at work is diverse because if we're all the same, we'd make the same mistakes. So I like it when it's diverse. And equity. So equity recognizes you can't treat each person, each group of people the same because they experience different barriers that impact every aspect of their life. And I mean every aspect of their life. It it impacts their education, view of self, worldview, employment, everything. There's no point where I take off my backpack and I stop being my identities. They engage in every piece of my day-to-day life, how I view my body, how I view my interactions with others. It is just a framework for me. And what equity also recognizes is that everyone might have experienced hardship in their life, but that specifically the barriers that certain groups experience are because of systemic and historical discrimination. So this is how I vision it in my head. I need a practical application of things. These are pretty lofty terms. So I always think of equity as the path, and the result of equity programming is meaningful diversity, equality, and inclusion. So when we target barriers, we do so through an equitable lens. And as a result, hopefully there's a different group of people who can be involved in our space. All of these are still action words. They all require intentional work. They involve making sure people feel good, lots of conversations, difficult conversations as well. And in some cases, these things can be measured, and in some cases they can't. And just know that equity work is never really done. Like, you can do some programming and then be like, okay, now we need to do more programming, a different group of people. So it can feel overwhelming. I understand that. And when we think about these in practical application, I usually break it down, and we'll circle back to this quite a lot today, into the path to sport, the entry to a space or to sport, and their experience in that space. So these are 3 distinct moments in time that we can target in different ways in order to make folks feel comfortable and accepted as well. Okay, so with that, let's get a little bit more specific to paraswimming. I want you folks to write down, and this is a personal reflection, so I'm not going to ask you folks to share it with the larger group, but just for yourselves, I want you to write down 3 reasons you don't have more paraswimmers. Okay, so 3 reasons you don't have more paraswimmers. And as you're thinking about this, you can put yourself in their shoes. I always suggest empathizing. It doesn't mean that you'll understand their experience necessarily, but I like to at least center myself in trying to understand what they might be feeling. Okay, so part of my job as a DEI specialist is to name elephants in the rooms that we're in. So these are ones I've heard verbally said out loud to me around swim spaces, around sports spaces, and they're just important to know that they're not true. So it is too much work, and we don't have a lane or coach capacity. So that really means to a person that you're too difficult. And the reality is, at entry level to swimming, it may mean smaller groups or a smaller engagement, but that's also how a lot of swim clubs are already set up, that at entry level, you're in smaller groups, it's safer. And then as we move up, it just means that maybe there's some moving around that is needed or different accommodations. But the idea that paraswimmers are just too much work is really quite harmful. They don't want to swim. This is just untrue. So it's like when they pulled, in the United States, they did this poll of boys and girls at a certain age to be like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And equal numbers of boys and girls said that they wanted to be the president of the United States at some point. By the time they hit teenage years, the number of girls has gone drastically down. So it's not that para athletes don't want to swim, or folks with disability don't want to learn to swim, it's that they don't have a way that they see themselves in that space. Okay. And there aren't that many para people out there, para athletes out there, potential para athletes. Yeah, that's not true either. There's just like a large number of folks walking around and rolling around and all over the place who could be in the pool and just aren't. It is a much larger number than you would think, and they are out there. We just need to figure out how to see them and to know that they can be in our space as well. Okay, so this one's going to be a group reflection, which means I'm looking for you folks to put stuff in the chat. So be prepared to be active, folks. I will do an awkward facilitator pause and just stare at you folks until you put things in the chat. So I'm looking at you. I want you to look at the issues you wrote down, why you don't have more para athletes, and put down where in the buckets they fit. So is it in path? Is it in entry or experience? So please share in the chat. And they might not fit perfectly in one or the other, but why in the question, why don't you have more para athletes? Where do you think it fits? Path, entry, experience. Paths, yeah. Thank you, Josh. Anyone else? And oh, I forgot to mention, we're using the Zoom chat. So if you're putting it in other places, Zoom chat. Paths, entry, okay, great. Anyone else? Entry, facility, accommodation. Good, okay. So getting you folks warmed up to using the chat. You're just all gonna have to hang out with me for interactive facilitation today. Yeah, so the tendency is we see the barriers in the path. The tendency is to entry, more parents thinking their child cannot do it. Yeah, so there's a lot of pieces here. So some of it, so entry physical, like there's that physical barrier. There's the emotional barrier. And that entry point tends to be a large spot where things are breaking down. I will also challenge us that the experience often means folks leave as well. So that's also a piece of it. So paths and entry. So great, we're now starting, what we're gonna do today is do a lot of breaking things down. So that's a good step. Before we start setting goals and thinking about how we target this, I'm going to do a divergence down a very geeky area of the world called universal design. So universal design is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent by all people regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. Basically, universal design is good design. So what universal design does is take into considerations all the types of people who might use a space, might use a physical thing, might use a policy, and think about different ways it might be used and accessed. So this is a group reflection, looking for this in the chat again. So I'll be looking for the chat, but curb cuts. Let's talk about curb cuts. So curb cuts are like one of the go-tos for talking about universal design. Who are curb cuts designed for? Let's start there. Who are curb cuts designed for? Why did we originally create a curb cut? And so folks who can't see my screen, or if you can't see the screen, a curb cut is where there's a raised piece around the walking part of streets, and it goes down onto the street, so it slants down onto the street. Wheelchairs, cars, yes. Great, perfect. So that's an easy win. So curb cuts were originally created for wheelchairs. It was an advocacy effort that advocated for the ability for people who use wheelchairs to be able to easily get themselves up onto the sidewalk from the street in a way that wasn't dangerous and also didn't necessarily need other people to help them. So thinking about practical application now, who uses curb cuts and what do they use them for? So someone already mentioned bicycles. So bicycles use curb cuts, that's right. Who else uses curb cuts? What do we use them for? Parents with strollers, heck yes. Imagine not having them and having to like bump your baby down every time. Like it would like start crying and be sad. Anyone else with curb cuts? Who else uses them? Everyone, yes. We all use them, right? We expect them. Our feet are used to them. Skateboards, yeah. Good. Okay. So it's called the curb cut effect. Again, it is a center of something called universal design. And it's a good example of how you make one change for one group of people, but it actually benefits a whole slew of people. So cool things about curb cuts, like go down the rabbit hole moment. So again, 1970s advocacy movement and introduced curb cuts to the world. But the cool part about it is that there was a drastic decrease in falling injuries around roads, which was amazing. It reduced traffic fatalities, which was great. It is a physical indicator of recognition of end of sidewalk. So folks with visual impairments, people impaired by alcohol, or someone looking at their phone, totally able to like physically feel the end of space. And increased traction to reduce slipping. So that was part of the reduced falling injuries. There's usually kind of like bumps right there. So during the winter, it actually reduces slipping as well. So you can think about all the different ways curb cuts are very useful. And there are other ones in the world that make a ton of sense, right? So one of my favorites is on buses. On buses, there are visual and audio indicators of what stop you're at. So if you've ever ridden on a bus in a place where they don't have that, especially if you have no idea where you are, or like you're in a new city, those visual and audio cues are what let you know where to get off. That you're like, I'm looking for this road, I hope I get it right. If you're on your phone and you have your headphones in, you can look up to see where you are. If you're on your phone and don't have headphones in, you can listen to hear where you are. All of these are changes that people created for folks who have disabilities, but as a result, it increases use for so many other people. So when we're making changes in our club, it's just really important to know that you may be creating a beneficial change for one group that you're like, I hope this goes over well, but it might actually impact your entire club as well. So it's just good design versus like specific design. So when it comes to universal design principles, and I'll read these out, there are 7 basic principles. And while these are normally applied in specifically things like buildings and street design, I think these can be used for things like policies and programs as well. So principle 1 is equitable use. The design is useful and marketable to people of diverse abilities. So equitable. Principle 2 is flexibility in use. The design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. So what that really is looking at is that you don't have to follow a specific path to use it, that there's alternative paths in order to use something. So for instance, maybe your club has a policy that complaints of a specific nature go to a specific person, and you have to, the person is now, and it only happens as that complaint can only happen if that person takes initiative and says it out loud and is willing to do it. So as a person who has had some negative experiences with authority, that would make me very nervous, especially if it was someone who made me nervouser, right? So flexibility in use would be providing various avenues for filing complaints. One being written, one being spoken, one being anonymous, variety of use. So allowing people to use different ways to get to things. A really good example of this is now our technology. So there are multiple ways to do things on your phone. You can phone someone from a text message. You can phone someone by dialing in their number. You can phone someone via going to your last calls. Those are all getting you to phoning someone, but you did it in the way you chose to do it. Okay, principle 3, simple and intuitive to use. Use of design is easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. So something should be easy to use. I think about how we deliver practices. So I have ADHD. When people deliver me practices verbally, I struggle a lot. So having a written version that I can go through it piece at piece, I'm not going to remember large chunks at a time. It's not the way my brain works. My brain is structured differently. And those large chunks I find very difficult to memorize. And I put a lot of effort into memorizing, and then I don't put a lot of effort into anything else. So if you think about this, simple and intuitive to use would be just providing different types of ways to use something as well. Write it up, verbally say it. Perceptible information. The design communicates necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of the ambient conditions or user's sensory abilities. So similar to what I just said, provide information in different ways. If an athlete isn't understanding something, it is our job as coaches to change how we're describing things. It's not their job to figure out why they're wrong at understanding. What that creates is just anxiety. right? So different information, how do you access it? Providing on your website the accessibility directions into a building and how that is going to be done, so that someone is able to see it on your website, maybe a video where they can watch the video and see where the accessibility doors are, where the accessibility washrooms are, just providing different avenues to engage in the information. Principle 5 is a tolerance to error. The design minimizes hazards and the adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. So tolerance to error means that if something goes wrong, that you are able, the system doesn't automatically fail. And so, like, my mother is terrible with technology. She has, like, watching her with a cell phone is horrifying. She'll be like, how do I push the button? How do I start the thing? The good thing is that there's a tolerance to error, that she doesn't know how to hang up a cell phone, but the other person hangs up and it just shuts down. So it all works. She just waits until someone else hangs up. There's like little ways for tolerance of error, right? It shouldn't be that if you don't walk a perfectly straight line, that the whole thing falls apart. Principle 6, low physical effort. The design can be used effectively and comfortably with a minimum amount of fatigue. It should not be the hardest thing. And so if you think of people who've experienced marginalization, if you think of someone who has a physical disability, they are constantly, endlessly navigating a world not designed for them. And so what we can do is try to make it easier. Try to make an easier path so that it doesn't feel like they're constantly, endlessly trying to navigate the world around them. That there's little things that are like, oh, you thought of me, you know I exist, thank you. Something as simple as, you know, there isn't an accessibility ramp into the building, but maybe there's an alternative door you can use, and noting alternative doors on your website or on registration packages and things like that. And finally, principle 7, size and space for approach and use. There should be appropriate size and space is provided for approach, reach, manipulation, and so on. Appropriate, it's appropriately sized. And that can be in things like policy and programs. We don't need to always be designing the biggest, newest, most amazing thing. When you have limited resources, maybe you need to make small adaptations, and maybe that will be just as meaningful. And also where you're at right now. It's really important to meet yourself, meet your club, meet your athletes where they are at. And they might not be where you want them to be. And that's okay. Their confidence isn't high enough yet. They don't know how to engage in the space. Just kind of, there you go. So you have to meet people where you're at, and also just meeting a club where they're at. Maybe like you don't have a gazillion resources to throw at this. That's fine. That doesn't mean you can't make change. It's just that it's going to be a little different looking. Okay, so what does this look like in swimming itself? And I'm going to ask you folks to think about this as well. This is not a comprehensive list, but let's make a bigger list. So we're thinking about our swimming spaces and how we adapt things for athletes. So some examples here: capacity-based groups and age-based opportunities. So every single swim club struggles with how the heck do we structure our groups. And this is an endless question for time. But if your capacity is lower as an athlete, you shouldn't be completely excluded from your social group. So making sure that there are various opportunities to engage in different levels, somewhere along the lines. Smaller groups when younger, or lower capacity. lowest skill level. Rotating coaches to assist on other groups. And what this really does is, I think about a couple of times where I've seen like my national senior coach rotate down to lower groups, and that helps the athletes from different levels know that coach. But specifically, para athletes have a tendency to be elevated through the levels of swimming really fast. So it's important that they know the coaches that might be supporting them at major events as well. Increased expertise and creativity of coaches who are able to think outside of the box of traditional swimming techniques and tactics. So you need to try things and be willing to try things. Also verbalize, we're trying something. It's okay to say, hey, I don't know if this will work, but I want to try it and see how it works, see what happens. Coaches focused on individual needs, abilities of all athletes. So each athlete is different. Each athlete should be approached differently and as a different person. You can't treat them all the same. I had an athlete who suffered from just intense depression and anxiety. They loved being at the pool, but sometimes it meant they couldn't swim. So they didn't. They'd just show up and chill on the side of the pool or do some dry land. And sometimes that was all they could do that day. But that was a success for them. So I met them where they were at. I could have forced them into the pool. I could have told them off for what they were doing. They would have quit. And so it was my ability to keep someone by simply meeting them where they were at and explaining to the other athletes, like, hey, we need some kindness. You are doing more work than this person, but like, can we approach this with some kindness for each other? More eyes in the pool deck to provide feedback for all athletes. I have worked in clubs where I've been the only coach on the pool deck, and I've worked in clubs where I've had multiple coaches on the pool deck. If you can, figure out how to rotate coaches and pair them off with each other so that there's multiple people. That also helps with the rule of 2. And more programming options for all abilities. So offering different clinics, different levels. Maybe you do a breaststroke clinic day. Maybe you do different levels of things, a girls only space. And making sure folks can have experiences with different people in the club, rotate around. Does anyone have any other examples of ways you can design something for para athletes or things you have done? Anyone have any examples? Yeah, of course. Unmute away.
Hi, how are you today, Laura?
Good, how are you?
Good. My question is actually twofold. So we, for the past 4 years, have created a para program to the best of our ability so far. The club has shown initiative in accepting para athletes into the club and finding ways to do that. My experience with para is quite long, but for the club, it's new. And so as we move forward, some of the roadblocks that they feel like roadblocks. I don't think they are, but they feel like roadblocks. I have 2 athletes, different ages. One is older, one is younger. Going back to return to training after COVID, I'm not able to provide them with the same opportunity to come into the regular lane situation. So I've created an extra lane for only 2 athletes, 2 para athletes. My problem is how do I approach parents and that communication? They feel that those swimmers are being segregated and not included, but the space that is so limited right now as we return to swimming, this is the only viable option that I can do right now. That's the biggest issue for me. And so when I see the examples in swimming, all of those things that are great, but it's the communication with the parents. And how do you have any suggestions on that?
Yeah. So first I would, instead of doing constant lane division. My approach, and Darda, maybe I'll get you to jump in as well here. My approach would be to actually assess by practice. So can you actually integrate them into lanes during something like warm up that has maybe a larger amount of time break between things? Can you adapt some of their sets, but have them so if a group is doing 50s, maybe they do a 25 on the same time, they're in the same lane, but they're doing 25. So they get to see each other, see people more often. So actually kind of putting a critical question on if they need their own lane. And sometimes the groups do need to be divided out, and lanes, just like any group, where you have your like very fast kids on one side and then you kind of like time it down. Do they actually need specific lanes would be something I would ask myself and be pretty intentional about. And speaking with parents, it's asking them also what they think their youth needs and including them in the decision making. So that's going to be the biggest piece, even if you have an idea of what needs to be done, including parents and the athlete themselves in the decision making itself. And Darda, maybe I'll throw it to you to also comment.
Yeah, I think in this situation, Janet, I'm assuming that most of that is being done due to pandemic restrictions. And I think at this point, we just need to be as open and honest with parents and athletes as possible about the restrictions that we're all currently under.
Yeah, because pandemic restrictions do change things quite a lot, obviously. And that one, you just have to, make the best choices that you can, but include them in the conversation and be very open and honest.
And Janet, I think I'm guessing that you have a plan for when you move to the next stage, when it might look that they can be reintegrated into other practices, and maybe explaining that to the parents that there is a long-term plan to this, but these are the steps that we currently have to make in order to get there. And just being upfront on what it's going to look like when they can get to where things were in the past. I think I'm hopeful that most parents are pretty open to that at this point. We're all doing the best we can to get our athletes in the pool as safely as we can. And so hopefully these parents are understanding and open to that.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for sharing with everyone, Janet, because I'm sure other people are also having similar situations. So thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm. So if you have more ideas, pop them in, and we'll kind of, as a group, collect more. I would like to go to the way in which I like to do planning when I'm working in DEI spaces. And what I'm going to ask you folks to do is draw a staircase on your paper, on your notes. So draw a staircase. At the bottom, you're going to put you. At the top, you're going to put para-athletes. But this is going to be a little bit of a structure that we work off of here. And I'm going to break this down even more. So I'm going to keep kind of breaking it down into different areas you can think about. Before we jump too far into it, learning theory divides learning into 3 distinct outcomes. And I want to touch on these because you can't make meaningful change without knowing what you're targeting. So knowledge is simply our understanding of information, that we know information and we're able to access information. So knowledge in this case would be the knowledge that there is an accessibility ramp for me to access if needed. Belief is what we feel, our attitudes towards things. And so belief is really hard to target. And I'll say it's one that we have to think about. And then finally, skill. skills is the ability to do something. So when you have knowledge and you have a belief, you're usually able to perform a skill. And we can apply this to swimming in the most basic way too. You know how freestyle is supposed to look. You believe you can do it, and so therefore you do it, right? Skill. So they all connect to each other. But keep those in your mind: knowledge, belief, skill. And so that's how we divide learning theory up. And it's a nice way to think about objectives. So starting at the top, I know this looks confusing, but it's not. I want you to write down a goal for para-athletes in your club at the top. And what would be lovely is if you can do a bit of a brainstorm with your athletes at some point where they write their goal. And not necessarily their personal goals, but like, what is the collective goals for para-athletes in your club? And this might be something so simple as like, get a para-athlete on the national team. Yeah, that could be a goal. Increase your numbers of para-athletes. Have a para-athlete at every level: regional, provincial, national, international. Your choice. So once you've got a goal, we're going to think about what your current barriers to that goal are. So it's really important when thinking of groups that have experienced marginalization to think about what barriers they have experienced and continue to experience. And when we do that, we are able to think through then solutions. But if you don't think about the barriers first, it's hard to get to solutions. And so when we think about those barriers, think about barriers to path, barriers to door, and barriers to experience. Start at path. At the beginning, we all brainstormed reasons why we don't have more para-athletes, and a lot of folks pointed to entry, path, that sort of space. So what are those barriers? Knowledge of your program. An advocate in community who advocates and connects youth to you. Do you have one? Someone within your community who speaks very highly of their experience in the community, in your swim community. What is the door, barriers to the door? So we mentioned a physical one, like your building is just not set up for it. Other entries, what's my experience going to be like there? Will I be treated nicely? Will people understand me? Then the experience of it too, like how many microaggressions do I run into? Are the coaches weird and awkward around me? People know when people have been weird to them. Okay. So I hope you have a barrier for each. And then for each barrier, we're going to split that apart to who is involved: the athlete, the coach, the board of directors, the other athletes. Who is involved in that situation in the most like acute way? So if you think about experience, and the experience for the athlete is that the coaches are kind of weird to them, or just like awkward. They don't want to talk about the like impairment that they have. They don't want to actually target it. So then the person who's involved is the coach, athlete, but mostly coach. Okay, so who's involved? The next step is what knowledge, belief, skills are needed to change the situation. So in my example around coaches are awkward, that coach needs to have their knowledge increased of that specific impairment, but also ways in which other para-athletes are modifying their strokes for that specific impairment. The coach needs to have a belief that something can change and that this athlete is worthwhile and that they can have the confidence to ask the awkward questions. And the coach needs to have the coaching skills, which I think probably isn't the problem in this situation, but it's really around knowledge and belief. And I would recommend, highly recommend, that all your coaches that are full-time go to some para events to watch them. I know my first event, I was watching the breaststroke and watching all the different ways that breaststroke was done. And I was like, ow, that's why I had been struggling with one of my athletes. I didn't think of doing breaststroke that way. And I was like, why don't we try that? Right? So you learn a lot. Build your knowledge, build your skills. This is not an area that you necessarily know about by default. It's not an area you've experienced necessarily because you didn't have that person's life experience. So you have to learn about it somehow. Knowledge, belief, and skills. And then beside each of those, I want you to put down what resources you need. And the resources might be YouTube. Resources don't need to be money. They can be. Asking someone, athlete's voice, again, cannot express enough. Folks who live with a disability know what they need more than anyone else. Anyone else. And so at work, for instance, it's not exactly the same, but I ask my boss to send me an email with high-level asks or to walk me through high-level asks slowly so that I can remember them. Because if not, as a person whose brain is very, I need specific things to help me keep on target. Just different resources, different asks. Okay. So what we've now done is we've set a goal for a club around para-athletes. We've thought about the barriers, and we've thought about the things that are needed to remove those barriers, specifically in knowledge, belief, and skills. Okay, so we're going to add. So I know these it seems a lot, but what I can recommend is anytime you're making a plan, break it down into the smallest pieces you can. It's like Lego. You start with one brick and then you build. So in that staircase, I asked you to put you at the bottom. And we've already thought about where we want to get to with our para-athletes. We want to get to this goal, and we've thought about the barriers we know and what they know, believe, and do, and how we break down those bits. Using that as a guide, I want you to work your way down the stairs, because what you're eventually going to do is work your way up the stairs. So in the middle is what do we need to do? So at the top, hopefully at the top of the stairs, clients are very empowered, para-athletes are very empowered to focus on goals and to achieve things there. What we should have done is created a bit of a structure around what barriers exist, on what we need to change in order to get to that goal. And before even that, you always start with you. So you have to start with you. in all pieces of DEI work, your place is to do research first before asking a person to explain their experience. Do research, do some reading, go to the internet, ask the internet, look up some videos. Always start with you as the first step. What knowledge do you need? What belief do you need? What skill do you need? No belief do. Okay, and target it in that way. What knowledge do I need? Would have been around, for the instance with breaststroke, I needed to know that some athletes who do not have the balance of both legs might need to do more than one stroke low. Some people do that, some people don't. I needed to have the confidence to introduce it to my athlete. I also had to have the language to introduce it to my athlete. In terms of skill, I needed the language to explain it. So you always start with you, and then you work your way up, and you work your way back down. And as you're doing that, you think about path, door, and experience. So what you could make in a very large level is a big matrix where you think about, what do you need to know about an athlete's path to the sport? What knowledge do you need to have? What belief do you need to have? What skills do you need to have around path? What do you need to have in terms of door, experience, path, and knowledge, belief, and do? And then up, what do we need? What does our club need? What does our board need? What does the other coaches need? What do the athletes need, the peers? Right? Because oftentimes we're setting the environment of how the youth engage with each other. And so there might need to be some building of empathy amongst your youth. There might need to be some understanding about why, an athlete is in one section and not the other section, or why there's integration, or why just understanding and belief is really important, so that we can eventually get to those larger athlete goals, para-athlete goals. So this is how I like to break things down when making plans. So at work right now, I'm the chair of both our Reconciliation Action Plan and our Global DEI group. And we've essentially done this. So we have thought about us as a DEI group, global group. What do we need to know? And then we've thought about what do the larger community need to know, so that we can help a group of people up here experience things in a good way. If you don't do something like this, and we speak about this all the time, is that you will get your first or person in the door, and you won't be ready for them. And so you want to be making preemptive change. You want to be making change before the first person walks in the door and says, I need this. Just to be ready for it, just to be like thinking ready for it. Because ultimately what happens is, if you're not, that person feels excluded, awkward, like they're asking for a lot of things. And so an example is around your first non-binary athlete. So someone who does not identify as either male or female, is non-binary or trans or wherever they are, it's a spectrum. I hope that you have knowledge of where a gender neutral washroom is beforehand. So they're not like, hey, I need to go to the washroom, where is that? And it's just simply something that's you point out to every athlete. It just helps with making sure space feels inclusive. So thinking through this. So I want you now to do this. Okay, so I just explained it. I want you to write, and I'm going to give you a bit of like work time. Let's start on number 1. And if you feel comfortable writing it in the chat, write in the chat. What do you need to do as a first step that focuses on your knowledge, your beliefs, and your skills? So let's make a plan. When you make a plan, it is going up a set of stairs. It is small steps. You don't get to the top without going up a bunch of little stairs. So sometimes it is the tiniest changes. Sometimes it's something like on registration. We're going to change our registration form to ask what accommodations a person needs. And that's every time someone registers, they can put in what accommodations they need. And that's not asking them necessarily to identify their disability or impairment. That's asking them what they need. That's it. And so that in universal design means that someone who practices Ramadan will tell you once a year, I'm going to be fasting and I need that factored in, because we don't really want athletes doing the hardest that they've ever done while on fast. But that also means someone who has a wheelchair is like, hey, I need to be able to have a stair-free access to where I'm going to. It also means someone like me who has ADHD is able to say like, hey, I have ADHD, it causes me intense anxiety. Can you please help by providing visual cues of what I'm supposed to be doing? And gentle cues sometimes. I am someone who is highly triggered by yelling because of the type of violence I've experienced. And so when people yell at me, I actually have a tendency to shut down and be triggered. It'd be nice to be able to tell someone that in a way that doesn't need me verbalizing it out loud to them, because it's very embarrassing as an adult human, but as a teenager too, to be like, when you yell at me, I turn into a turtle. So that's an accommodation type that you could do. Simple thing. So little steps. What are little things you can do? One of them is looking into language considerations. I'm going to go over a couple of language considerations in a second, but looking into language considerations. One of them, doing a little research, looking at different types of athletes that have existed and how they swam. And then I'm going to ask you to write down some us steps. So us, I didn't specify who us is. On a very reasonable reason of you define us. Who is us? Is us the coaches? Is us the administration? Who is us in your mind? But what are some path, door, and experience things you can do that are little steps? Because little steps add together for big steps. So like in path, as I mentioned, maybe the registration form includes a question about accommodations. Maybe the registration form includes a question about if you need assistance. Maybe the door, a person's first experience in swimming, maybe you have an option for a bigger group or a smaller group. Or a one-on-one assessment, which most swim clubs do one-on-one assessments with all athletes. So offering that as an option means that one, everyone has access to it, but it means that if someone who's maybe a little bit unsure will have a very small experience before they're thrown into the group. An experience, finding different ways to get feedback. Doing a collaborative brainstorm. So agency, human agency, person's agency, youth agency is really important. In order to have agency, you need to have a voice in the room, and you need to have actual decision-making power. So how do you help athletes have that, where they don't feel like they're cornered and that, like, you know, this is the only option for them? And it could be simple things like, I was working with a man who, in Toronto, who he was in a wheelchair, and in order to get home, he needed to be picked up by an accessibility van and taken away. Now, this van sometimes would take 2 to 3 hours to come pick him up on certain days of the week, because there was busier days of the week. And so when we found that out, we were like, well, what day of the week works for you? And he's like, oh, it's usually quieter on, I think it was like Monday. It's usually quieter on Monday. And we're like, okay, we'll just change all of our meetings to Mondays, and then it's much easier for you to get home. It was a simple change, but it involved him having to tell us. We don't know a person's experience until we ask them. And despite, it's a delicate balance, despite asking them, their job is not to teach you. So just know that some people don't want to teach you about their experiences. It's tiring. I'm someone who is okay with teaching. I think Darda has put herself forward as someone who's okay with teaching. Just check who is okay and just be getting feedback without forcing it. And then, as I mentioned, like, as much as we set a goal for para-athletes, at eventually one point, when you look at the staircase, you want para-athletes to be setting their own goals for your club. Okay, I'm just going to check the time. Okay. Language. This is the last little bit for me. Language is hard. It is awkward. No one likes it. We feel confined by it. We feel like it's always changing, and it is. What I will say is that it feels like we're always changing because humans who have been marginalized are just now being allowed to have a voice. It has always been hurtful. It has never not been hurtful. It's just that now we're allowed to say that hurts. Please don't. So know that language is changing. Below are my 6 steps to language that I follow, which are, you'll get it wrong. You will. Someone might correct you, and that's fine. So someone will tell you, because it is all individual. Some people are okay with some words and some people are okay with other words. For instance, in the Indigenous community, I use Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, but you'll hear some people say Native. I don't use that word. I don't like it. Most people in Canada don't use it, but in the United States, it's very common to use Native. So it's all a little individual to know about that. When you get corrected, it's not about you, it's about them. Okay, so just know that it's just not about you. And this is not, they're not telling you as a way to correct you, they're telling you as a way to make their world more safe for them. Okay, so it hurts. I get that fluttering, sinking feeling in my chest when people tell me I've done something wrong. That's okay. It's about them. Okay, and center them in your empathy. It will feel gross. It does. You didn't mean to do something wrong necessarily. You might have, who knows? But it will feel gross. It is not their responsibility to fix it and to fix your feeling gross. That's not the point. It's not the part where you go, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me? No, just be like, okay, I did it wrong. Thank you for telling me. Onwards and upwards. Because oftentimes what happens is the person who's been corrected now needs to be made feel like it's okay, be told it's okay. And what we just said is it's not okay. So don't make me now make you feel good. And next time, just do better, right? That's all you got to do. So those are 6 hard steps Language is hard, but language does hurt. The old sticks and stones will break your bones, but words never hurt you. They do. Words have caused me to go into intense panic attacks. Words have caused me to be incredibly hurt and to relive trauma I didn't want to relive. So it is possible to hurt people with your words. Okay, para swimmer. Here's some just basic recommendations. These are super simple. Para swimmer is a swimmer with an impairment. People with disabilities or swimmer with disability, we always put the person first, and that goes across the board. So a good example right now in the news is it's not a homeless person, it's a person experiencing homelessness. Make the human the first thing. They are a human. They are in front of you, they're a person. Paralympics. You get this one a lot. It's not the Paralympics. And it's not interchangeable with the Olympics. It's the Paralympics. It's different. It is special. You wouldn't interchange Olympics with Paralympics for able-bodied swimmers, so don't interchange them. They are just different things, different, equally awesome events. Be curious. Ask someone, how do you think you could do this drill? Do you need assistance? If yes, what type? Just ask. And you don't need to dance around the fact that there's a difference. It is. You've never experienced it, or maybe you have. But just ask what needs to be done. How would you adapt this drill? Do you want to try this way? Be a little curious with your questions. And don't avoid the disability. Talk about how it impacts their stroke, their use of equipment, get comfortable with the topic. You might be uncomfortable with the topic, but they're not. That's just, it's the reality of their life. So talk about how it impacts them. Talk about how it changes their stroke, the balance of their stroke in a scientific way. Oh, I think this is a horizontal axis stroke, but your horizontal axis is slightly off balance, so maybe we can balance it this way. Simple things that way. Things to avoid, handicap. It's a derogatory term. Historically, it was a term used because folks with disability were often turned out onto the streets and they would have a cap in hand and be collecting money. Don't use it. That's just one to take out of your vocabulary, strike it out, never use it again, unless it's in this context and explaining why not to use it. Brave, courageous, or inspirational. This is so common. Paraswimmers are swimmers. They are there. They are not exceptional nor tragic. Sometimes, right? Like if you were working with a young swimmer who's like 6 or 7 and they do something for the first time, I'd be like, that's brave. But I would say that to anyone. Just because you're a para swimmer doesn't mean you need to be being told constantly that you're just brave for existing and doing the normal things that you're asking all the other swimmers to do. Avoid talking to a person's guardians or assistants. Talk to the person no matter what. I don't care how old they are either. Talk to the person. People with disabilities are constantly used to not being focused on, not being talked to, and people thinking that they are generally not able to communicate for themselves. It takes their humanity away from them. And that is something to avoid. So talk to the person no matter what. If it's a young person, talk straight to the young person while the parents are nearby and it can be clarified. Even if you know that they're unable to hear you, for instance, you still talk to them. And then their translation will help if need be. But don't make assumptions on that part. That gets me to my end of this session. So I hope you've done some good brainstorming, thinking, made a couple simple changes or simple ideas for ways to make little steps to change and inclusion. Inclusion is hard, and this work isn't easy, and it may feel like you can't do something, but the idea is that we just make little steps to change and keep trying. And I'll turn it over to questions, and Darda can join in with me. I know she has some pieces to share as well. But thank you everyone for being on, and if you have any questions, ask away.
All right, thank you, Laura, for another great session. Very practical points in there. Laura, I know in your last session, you put your email in the chat. If you're comfortable doing that again, so people can contact you if they have any questions, that would be great. Yeah, Laura has a lot of experience in many different areas, and so we're very, very fortunate to have her being part of this part of the conference and sharing her expertise in this area. I know that I've really enjoyed conversations that I've had with her, and I've learned quite a bit from her in just some brief conversations we've had, so I really appreciate that. Moving forward, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat. I'm going to just share my screen for a quick second because I want to talk about the REACH webinar series just a little bit more. So this was session 1 of our REACH webinar series to answer questions about paraswimming and to educate the swimming community in general as to some of the commonly asked questions around paraswimming. So coming up today at 3 o'clock, we're going to be doing number 2, which is becoming para ready. So what this is actually a document. So it's a tool that you can use to do many of the steps that Laura talked about, kind of go through things to think about before you even have a para athlete come into your program. These are some practical steps that you can take. And this is a general document. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about it within the swimming context. So how it is applied within a swim club, in a swim practice. So I hope that you'll join us for that. Number 3 is promote and connect, marketing and relationship building. And that is happening on October 6th at 7 p.m. And we're going to be having Dave, Sora, and Franco Taverna from the Center of Accessible Sport and Play talking about how to make connections in your communities, where to make those connections and where to find potential para athletes. Their experience is a lot within the realm of soccer, but they are going to come over and apply it to swimming. So I'm very happy that they're going to be joining us. Session 4, which is the how, the day-to-day para programming. So this is going to focus on what is it to have a para swimmer in your program. We're going to have a panel of coaches sharing different pieces of experience of what they've had to think through and what worked through and what they feel are some of the benefits that they've experienced, some of the challenges maybe of working with para swimmers, and how you can ask questions on how this might work within your environment. And so that's going to be on October 20th at 1 p.m. Number 5 is gaining clarification. Classification explained. So classification, there's always lots of questions and uncertainty around this topic. So I'm very happy we're going to be having Janet Dunn, who is Swimming Canada's classification lead, is going to be on for that hour on November 3rd at 7 p.m. And she's going to be there to answer any of our classification questions. A very candid, open conversation is what I'm hoping is going to happen at that session. So please come with your questions. Session 6 is all about competitions. What does this look like? What kind of considerations need to be taken by coaches as well as officials? We're going to have 2 very experienced officials who've done quite a bit in para swimming competitions, both nationally and internationally. So very happy to have them on. That is on November 17th at 7 p.m. And then our last 2 sessions are focusing on the journey. What does the pathway look like? The first one, the 7th session is on coaches, sorry. What does the coaching pathway look like? That's going to be on December 1st at 1 p.m. And then the last one's going to wrap up our series on December 15th at 7 p.m. is going to be talking about the para-athlete pathway. And we're going to have some athletes on to discuss what it looked like for them and what it can look like. We'll also talk about what it can look like going into the future. So I hope if you're interested, I hope you'll sign up for those so I can send you the Zoom information so you can get in on those. They are completely free and there are PD points available. These sessions are open to both coaches, club administrators, as well as parents and athletes. We know that many of these questions are across the board. So by all means, anyone is welcome who has an interest in learning a little bit more about what paraswimming is, what has to offer, and some of the challenges, and also some of the great benefits that come to working with para-athletes. All right. Excellent. Lindsay has put the reach information and sign up for future sessions in the description of this session. So you can find that link. I've put it on the slide here, but that link would be a lot quicker and easier to get to. I hope that we will see quite a few of you there. The next session begins in about a half an hour, so people can go get a stretch, get a drink, and come on back. That would be great. We look forward to having you here. Laura, any last minute things that you'd like to say?
Yeah, just I know that sometimes it's scary, so just take the brave step forward and see what you can do, and when in doubt, talk to someone about it and just bounce your idea off someone. But thank you so much, everyone. I just love the swim community, so keep doing what you're doing.
Excellent. Excellent. And Laura, we'll keep you in the loop in the family. You'll be around. I know you're not coaching anymore, but you're so valuable to us. So thank you so much. And we will definitely turn to you for your expertise in the future. I am sure of that. So on that note, I think we can end this session and everyone can go have a break, and we'll see everyone back here in about 33 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.